Well, I'd like to welcome you all here on behalf of the Sudbury, Wayland, Lincoln Domestic Violence Roundtable, and thank First Parish of Wayland for their hospitality, and also for the many ways that they share with us in all sorts of areas to do with the cause of preventing domestic violence and relationship violence in all its forms. They've been active partners, and we really appreciate it very much. The Roundtable is a non-profit group of volunteers. We're not-for-profit, sorry. We meet on the second Tuesday of every month, and our mission is to provide education programs for the community, to advocate on behalf of survivors, to liaise with various provider groups in the area, and to distribute literature and, most importantly, hotline cards with phone numbers of centres where people who feel they need help, they can call a long list of phone numbers. And we have, I'm just trying to think, we have at the moment, sorry to hesitate, we have at the moment coming up a fundraiser on the 5th of December, and that's going to be held at Selections Boutique in Sudbury next to TJ Maxx. And Karen Bregerberger, the owner, is very generously donating 10% of all proceeds that day to the Roundtable. So if you have any holiday shopping you'd like to do, then I urge you to consider the 5th of December, all day and into the evening till 9 o'clock. And also, the Community Outreach Committee is organising its annual holiday gift drive, whereby we take the wish list from a family who live in a shelter. And this year, our family is a young mum with a 2-year-old and a 2-month-old. And we take their list of presents they'd like for the holidays, and we try and buy them all, or as many as we can. And if you're interested in joining us, there is a sign-up sheet, which I'll just pass around. And if you'd like to add your name, someone will call you and let you know and give you a list of the items still outstanding. So without further ado, I will hand over to our speakers tonight, Laura Montanaro from Reach Beyond Domestic Violence, and Julie Udovin from Journey to Safety. And they will give, they spoke last Tuesday, and it was incredibly interesting and really quite inspiring. So I'll hand over to them now.
Thank you. So much. So, as Sue said, my name is Lauren Montanaro. I work at a local program called Reach Beyond Domestic Violence. We are based in Waltham. I work on our prevention team. So my job is to go out into the community, engage in conversations, support the supporters, as it were. We know that survivors are existing out in our communities regardless of location, and how can we provide information to those communities that are already providing a source of strength. So Julie and I both work on the program committee for the Lincoln Sudbury Wayland Roundtable, and we were thinking of faith communities as a natural place where survivors might be coming for strength, for congregation, where they may be turning for support. So we created this program for those communities to better provide support to survivors and to know what resources are available to offer those supports as well. Before we jump into the content of today, a quick note on taking care of ourselves. This is my puppy, who is my greatest source of self-care, so I wanted to share a picture of him. His name is Xander. He's now 3, but that's my favorite photograph of him. We are going to be talking about some heavy stuff today. It is going to be a hard conversation at times, and different things can come up for different people. And you may need to take care of yourself in more physical ways as well. If you need to use the restroom, if you need to grab a refreshment, if you need to just step out and breathe some fresh air, please feel free to do that. We will not be offended if you step out of the room at any time for any reason. Any questions before we get started? All right, so without further ado, when you hear the term domestic violence, when you hear the term abuse, dating violence, intimate partner violence, what is it that comes to mind for you? What are the sounds, the images, the descriptions? Bruises, sure. Anger, yelling. Control, absolutely. We often hear things like someone lashing out, someone trying to maintain the power in a relationship, gain that power in a relationship. It can look different in different settings, but what we know is that abuse is about a pattern of behaviors that one person uses to both gain and maintain power and control in a relationship. We know from this definition that I'm sharing with you that abuse is not a one-time incident. this isn't just someone losing control. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It's a series of behaviors whose intention is to both gain that control and maintain it over a period of time. We also know that abuse is not just limited to relationships of men and women. Abuse happens at about the same rates in the LGBTQ community. Abuse happens across socioeconomic lines at about the same rates. It happens in all religious traditions, all ethnic traditions. There's no group that's isolated from this issue. And yet we can do things among our own cultures to either uphold abusiveness as a norm or push back on it to hold abusers accountable. And that's what we'll be talking about today. Yes?
I've understood that proportionally in the LGBTQ community, there is a higher portion, perhaps, of abuse within the relationships.
The one
Any
community,
explanations for it?
yeah, the one community that seems to have higher statistics is bisexual women. And those numbers are fairly recent. The study came out in around 2015. So there are currently studies being done trying to get to the why. Right now we've identified the fact that it is, and now we're trying to think about it. But we know that women can be abusive to men, to women. Just yesterday I was talking with someone who was a transgender man who was abused by a woman in his relationship. So thinking about who we're talking to, who we're interacting with, and being able to connect in those ways. But it's happening at fairly equal rates. We do know that transgender people in general experience all forms of violence at a higher rate. Abuse in relationships specifically is closer to an even number with the general population. Any other questions? So we talked about the fact that abuse is a pattern. This isn't a one-time incident. Its intention is to gain and maintain power and control. That anyone can be abusive, anyone can be abused. We're going to talk next, and I'm going to invite Julie to come up here and share with us some of the things that abuse is not caused by. Julie?
I should turn these lights off to make this on.
I don't know if that's possible.
Okay, then that's not a good. Hi, everybody. As Sue said, I'm Julie Udovin, and I work at Journey to Safety, which is the domestic abuse program at Jewish Family and Children's Service. Whew, that made the magic happen. Thank you. So I just want to, first of all, add my own thanks to all of you. I know everybody here could be someplace else tonight, probably could have been 5 or 10 other places tonight. So thank you so much for being here. It really means a lot that you're here and learning and going to be speaking with us about this topic. So that's awesome. Thank you. So I know it's a little bit confusing when we say this is what abuse is, and then we make this sharp right turn and say, okay, now let's talk about what it isn't. So we are going to go back and talk in a minute a little bit more about what that definition really means. But for now, we just want to sort of talk briefly about what abuse isn't, because there's so much media mythology. There's so many things that we're told out in the world that this is what abuse looks like. And as Lauren pointed out, you know, when we often when we talk to groups and say, what is abuse, we hear about kicking and punching and things like that. So we're going to get to what abuse really looks like in a minute. But first, we want to talk especially about this anger management issue, right? This is a big myth that folks who are abusive have anger management issues. When researchers really took a look at this, what they found is that people with anger management issues have anger management issues. They don't manage their anger well. And so when they got angry, it came out at work, at home, with friends, bar fights, road rage, right? Because they didn't have good coping skills and good strategies for dealing with dealing with their feelings. As Lauren mentioned, folks who are abusive, the folks who are abusive don't have those issues. They're very much in control. They are choosing who to be abusive toward, and when, and where, and how. Those are choices that they're making. It's very different than anger management, where somebody needs to go to anger management classes to kind of figure out how to deal with these strong feelings. Folks who are controlling and abusive don't have those issues. It's a very different intervention. So forget that anger management piece. And in fact, we know that I think the number is about 25%, is that the number you use also? About 25% of folks who are abusive also have anger management issues. They have kind of all of it together, but they're still two different things. So it's important to hold that this isn't about somebody snapping, somebody going over the edge, somebody losing it. these are choices that folks make to behave in certain ways. So that anger management issue is important to set aside. It's also important to set aside that substance misuse, abuse idea, and we do get calls from folks who say, well, my partner has been drinking, and when my partner drinks, they become very abusive. And usually when we start to ask questions, we hear about a lot of controlling behavior that's happening all along. And that when a substance is introduced, maybe that's when the person becomes violent, or that's when the person is choosing violence. But it's not that you have a sober person who's not controlling or abusive, and then all of a sudden they take a drink or they misuse a substance and they become somebody else. When we look at it, we really see that controlling behavior is a pattern that's going through the relationship, but maybe the behaviors change a little bit when there's a substance issue involved. Also, most mental health difficulties, now there's still a fair amount of stuff we don't understand about the brain. We're learning more every day. We don't totally know everything, so I won't say this never happens, there's no such thing as a personality change. There are some things that can really transform a person, but for the most part, like substances, mental health challenges don't take somebody who's not abusive and turn them into a controlling or abusive person. And again, when researchers looked at these things and they looked at what happened when there were interventions, they saw that controlling pattern continue. So I want to just ask you to kind of set that stuff aside. That is part of our mythology about what abuse looks like. And then finally, this issue about codependency. I don't know how many of you, does anybody want to throw out when they hear the word codependent, what they think of? Or what it means?
Kind of like that love-hate relationship, they can't live with them.
Can't live with them. Yeah, so, and periodically we get this spate of self-help books, generally aimed at women, right, that are these things like women who love the men who treat them badly and they still love them anyway, those kinds of things. And in fact, what's true about codependency is that codependency is this idea that somebody is participating, it's enabling somebody, right? That word enabling, does that ring a bell? That a person may be enabling another person's behavior. So you call them into work if they, we hear codependency most often with drugs and alcohol, right? So they call the person into work if they're hungover, they're sick, or they can't, or the codependent person, does something that enables that person to continue that behavior. What we know for survivors is that people who are survivors of abuse are not enabling their abuse. They're not participating in it. They're not doing things that allow the person to continue behaving abusively toward them. What survivors of abuse know is if they stand up to that person and say, I'm not doing this anymore, there could be really dangerous, serious consequences, right? So when survivors call somebody in, and call in a work excuse or something like that, what they're doing is trying to keep their home environment as safe as possible. They're trying to move through that day so that they get to bed as safely as possible, and if there's children in the home, to protect the kids. That's not about enabling certain kinds of behavior. That's about how can I keep my environment as safe and as calm as possible so that I can move through this day, right? So it's important to forget, because the codependency model blames the survivor, says you're participating in this abuse. If you would just stand up to this person, you could stop this. And what we know from survivors who've tried this is that most of the time that doesn't work, and oftentimes things get worse. So I just wanted to kind of take all of that stuff, clear that all off the table, and shift to, am I doing slides? All right. I am the technological dinosaur. Okay, so when we think about abuse, there's not a test at the end of this where we're going to give you a bunch of abusive behaviors and ask you to draw lines to put them in categories. This is just kind of a way that we think about different types of abuse, because that idea of physical abuse is so prevalent and is so present. And in fact, there's a lot of other things that go on in abusive relationships. But let's start with examples of physical abuse. So what are some ways that you can think of that if somebody's being physically abusive, what might they be doing? What are some of those behaviors? This is not a trick question. It is as obvious as you think it is. Hitting.
You're just hurting somebody.
Hurting somebody. And I'm also going to expand this definition of physical abuse to include anything that puts a person's physical safety at risk. Right? So it doesn't have to be just contact. Other things that might put somebody in harm's way. Other examples folks can think of?
Throwing the phone away.
Say it again.
Knocking the phone out of her hand.
Knocking the phone out of somebody's hands. driving recklessly, and not letting the other person put their seatbelt on, right? I'm pointing like we drive on this side, like this way. Don't you trust me? Why would you need a seatbelt? Do you think that I'm going to get us into an accident? Those kinds of things, even though we know that seatbelts are a law, right? Doesn't matter. I would also add restraining somebody. We're not done with this conversation until I say we're done. Interrupting somebody's sleep, interrupting medications, changing meds up or preventing somebody from accessing any kind of medical care, moving assistive devices like crutches and walkers and hearing aids or glasses, making the person ask for things that they need. That all falls into that physical abuse category. So that's all part of it. What about emotional abuse? What are some examples that you can think of behaviors that are either emotionally or verbally abusive?
Insulting.
Insulting, absolutely. Insulting and humiliating. What else?
Shunning.
Shunning. Shunning and shaming, right? Other thoughts?
Putting down.
Putting somebody down, absolutely. Anything else? You're silent treatment, ignoring somebody, refusing to acknowledge somebody for days in some cases, and then the abusive person is the one who gets to decide when the silent treatment is over, right?
Getting children to take sides, just getting children.
Using children, I put them in a lot of these categories actually. Using children, and also undermining somebody's parenting. You can't do this because the other parent says no, or modeling for kids that it's okay to speak to the other person in this way when it is not okay to do that. So absolutely, all kinds of put downs, humiliations, and a lot of these things, again, remember, happen behind closed doors. These are not generally things we see in public, occasionally maybe, but not often. So under emotional blaming, we hear a lot of blame. This is all your fault. This is happening to you because you did something. If you didn't make me so mad, if you could have just remembered this, you're so stupid. Why? If you could just get this done, I wouldn't be this angry. I wouldn't have hit you. This is your fault, right? This blaming, we hear blame over and over again. So blame, shame, humiliation, all of those kinds of things. And these are behaviors. The physical abuse may happen every day, but it may happen a few times a week. It may happen a few times a year. It may never happen. There doesn't have to be physical abuse for a relationship to be abusive.
Threatening children or pets.
Yeah, threatening children or pets, harming children, absolutely, all of those things. And so emotional abuse and a lot of these other categories are things that happen over and over again. Lauren is going to talk more about the pattern of abuse and how this is really a 24/7 experience for folks, even though the actual identifiable incidents when somebody calls and says my partner hits me may be something you can count on one hand or both hands, or it may be a huge number. It's the stuff that's happening all the time that's important not to lose as being a big part of what an abusive relationship is like. Financial abuse, we could do, I think Lauren and I could do 3-day seminars on every one of these categories. Don't worry, we're gonna get you out of here on time. But financial abuse, right? What would be some examples of financial abuse?
Could be either
Stealing.
or racking up, credit card bills.
Right, racking up credit card bills. And what happens if your credit is trash? What can you not do?
Get a loan.
Get a loan. What would you need a loan for?
Get away.
To get away, to get a car, to start a business, to become economically independent. Can't get an apartment, right? Trash credit is something we hear about all the time, and sometimes survivors don't even know about credit cards that have been taken out in their names. So handing out money like allowances, insisting on receipts, making the person, and this happens in wealthy households, making somebody beg for money for shoes or for a coat or to feed the family, putting the person on an allowance, telling the person, without me, you're gonna have nothing. If you leave, I'm gonna take all the money and I'm gonna hide it, I'm gonna give it away, I'm gonna buy a boat, I'm gonna do whatever it is. You will not get anything if you leave. And it's a very scary threat, right? So technology related, Things like demanding passwords, going through somebody's phone, going through somebody's email, going online as your partner, pretending to be your partner, right? Really breaking down any zone of privacy that they might have. Using the phone, I know there's those apps that parents can use to keep track of where their kids are, which I know a lot of our kids refer to as stalk my children apps. Using those apps inappropriately to track a partner and to keep track of where the partner is, watching the odometer in the car, all of these kinds of things, this constant surveillance that technology has enabled. Technology has also allowed for some things to become much safer, so I'm not going to say technology, and we certainly had domestic abuse before we had phones. But it's created new ways for abusive people to behave abusively. Sexual abuse is any unwanted sexual contact, but also comments. Comments about what gravity has done to your body. Comments about somebody's sexuality. Comments, all of those comments that are demeaning and insulting and harmful, in addition to sexual assault and other kinds of unwanted sexual contact. And then identity and spiritual, we're going to talk more about spiritual abuse in a moment, hence the invitation to faith community folks. But I want to call out that identity abuse is all of those things that make us us, right? All of those things that make us who we are. In the hands of an abusive individual, they can be essentially weaponized, right? Making fun of somebody's accent, threatening to out somebody, threatening to tell about somebody's gender identity, threatening to tell a secret, threatening to tell family secrets. All of these kinds of things are all bound up in this idea of identity abuse, is really taking apart somebody for who they are, right? So Lauren's now going to talk about the dynamics, but it's just important to kind of recognize that this is day in, day out, all the time, 24/7. It's not a matter of the incidents that we can list on a sheet and say this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Those things do happen, but all this other stuff happens in between.
And what we know is that if any of us went on a first date with someone who is doing all of those things that Julie just described, would there be a second date? No. So abusive relationships are confusing for lots of folks. This slide did this last time too. Nope. We're going to go backwards. Abusive relationships are surprising for lots of folks because they start off the same way that all relationships start. They start off in what we refer to as the honeymoon phase. So where you see that heart, those flowers, that's meant to be symbolic of that period of time where every joke that person makes is the funniest joke you've ever heard. And every time you see their name pop up on your phone, you're smiling. You want to spend so much time with them because you feel more beautiful, more worthy, more wonderful than you've ever felt in your life. But eventually, with abusive relationships, that will change. And we'll move into this period of what we refer to as tension building. For example, let's say we have this person who every other Friday night goes out to dinner with a bunch of their friends, and they get together, they spend time together, and they've started a wonderful relationship, and they really care about their partner, and their partner's texting them, and they've been texting nonstop for weeks now. And this person's friends say, oh my gosh, just be with us. Put your phone away, pay attention to us, and all right, I'll put my phone away. Phone goes in the bag, pays attention for dinner for the next 2 hours, takes out their phone. What's on that phone? Maybe there's 32 new text messages, 10 missed calls, 5 new voicemails. And the text messages start off sweet. What are you doing? What are you all talking about? Why aren't you answering? Did I do something wrong? Are you mad at me? And they start getting angrier and angrier, leading to those phone calls that were coming, to these voicemails that start off panicked and then get mad. This is what we refer to as an incident. That would be a really subtle thing. It's not necessarily physical abuse in any way, shape, or form, but there's an emotional component there. And there's an action happening, thinking back to that definition of trying to gain and maintain power and control. So what is that control that we're talking about? The ability to contact that person in this moment. I take my phone out and I see that many missed calls and text messages. What's my initial response? I might be making a face. I might be saying, oh my gosh, what's wrong? The only times I've gotten that many missed calls and that many text messages, someone was in the hospital. Something major had happened. But when I start reading them and seeing that anger, I might be off put. So maybe I get in a fight with my partner. We argue about it. I say, what the heck is this? This isn't okay. You can't expect me to be answering all the time. And my partner lashes back and says, I know. I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have sent all those text messages, but you always answer my messages. And when you stopped answering and I didn't know what was happening, I got so worried. And if you could just answer my messages, if you could just write back to me, if you could just let me know that you're okay, then I wouldn't have to worry. And I know, I trust you, I believe in you, but I was just so worried and I couldn't be okay if something happened to you. So if you could just let me know you're okay, then I wouldn't have to worry. This is where we move into this period of remorse. We might call this the hearts and flowers period, but is that a true apology, what I just described? No. What it is blaming the survivor, and it's a renegotiation of the boundaries in that relationship. Because if I agree to continue with this relationship, and I love this person, we've been together for 8 months and nothing like this has ever happened before, but all of a sudden, there's this change. And answering a text message is annoying, maybe, but it doesn't feel like a deal breaker for someone I truly care about. So maybe I say, okay, but you can't do that again. That's not okay. And they say, no, I know, I'm so sorry, I won't do it again, but if you can just let me know that you're okay. I couldn't be okay if something had happened. So the boundaries have changed. We move on. We go into this period of same old stuff, and that's kind of your average. You're bringing the kids to soccer practice, you're doing laundry, you're cooking, you're going to work. There's nothing really of note that's happening during that period. It's just life. But then it moves up into another period of tension. So now I'm down the road, and I am at work, and all of a sudden I find out that I have an important meeting that I need to stay late for. But I forgot to charge my phone, all of my other colleagues are out already, and I don't have a way of letting my partner know. My phone's died. So I stay at work because it's an important meeting, I'm stuck in that meeting, and I'm decide, okay, I'm just gonna have to let them know when I get home. What happens when I get home? That was really telling. How am I feeling on that drive? Probably really anxious, right? Really nervous, really upset. So I get home and I talk to my partner and they are mad. They're angry because they didn't know that I was okay. They've been freaking out. They've been calling all of my friends because I had agreed that I would let them know that I was okay, and I didn't do that. What's changed in this moment is that the boundaries had changed. So now there was that expectation, that control of how we interact in the relationship had changed. And what we know is that abuse changes the dynamics of the relationship over time. The length of period of time between abusive incidents can become shorter and shorter and shorter. Think it will stay there? And we also know if you look at those upper areas, the down parts of this graph are your periods of abuse not really happening. That's your average day-to-day. But if you look down the relationship, let's say that's 2-3 years down the relationship, the abuse that's happening then is worse, obviously, than the abuse early on. But the periods of same old stuff are actually more intense than the abusive incidents were early on in the relationship. Because what feels like a normal, average day-to-day moment has now changed through that dynamic of the wave of abuse model. And it's important to know that the person that I began that relationship with isn't a monster. That was the most charming, wonderful person that I'd ever met. But that person changed to me over time. The way they interacted with me has changed. What Julie talked about earlier was dispelling something that we often refer to as the monster myth. This feeling of, I could pick an abuser out in the crowd, I would know who that person is, I work in the field. And yet I still wouldn't necessarily know. There are people who I've been friends with, I found out have done atrocious things to their partners. And I didn't know because the person they presented to me was a very different person than they were presenting in their relationship. This is part of why faith communities are so important, because we get to know people in a different way, and very often, not always, but often, people will come into community with their partner, and there may be differences in ways we're able to support them. Are there questions about the wave of abuse model? I know I went through that a little fast. Yes?
this is just something to keep on teasing out as we look at the extremes. Many relationships that I've known or known about over the years contain elements of this. And helping us think about the distinctions between when it's truly abusive, when it's sort of normal control issues that many couples experience. You can keep that in mind as we go along and help us keep that in mind.
Yeah, I would go back to the definition of, is this a pattern of behaviors that's happening to gain and maintain control and power in the relationship? Or is this me being nervous about things that are happening at work and I'm lashing out because I have other things that are happening? We all have our worst days. We all will get in arguments and fights with partners, and none of us are perfect people. We've all made mistakes, myself included. And when we're talking about abusive relationships, it's a different level. And I also think it's important for us to recognize that those relationships of friends that we might be thinking of, that we've seen some controlling behaviors in, sometimes, not always, but sometimes, we're only seeing the surface of it, and there could be more to the story there as well. So being open to all possibilities when trying to reach out and support. But for the inward conversations, thinking back to that definition and holding ourselves accountable, because it's possible that we've done things that we wish we hadn't done as well, and how can we show up and be better in the future?
Okay. Yes, please. Yeah, no, and I think just to add on a little bit, okay, good. Just to add on a little bit to that great question, I think one of the things that we listen for are there are a lot of relationships that kind of exist in this gray area of unhealthy, and there are a lot of them, right? And then as Lauren said, most relationships, I won't say all, but I'll say most, a lot most, have moments where people wish they could take something back, wish they could unsay or undo something. That's normal, and it's the process of, you know, kind of coming back together and coming to a safe and healthy place for the couple. In abusive relationships, that just doesn't happen, and we listen for fear, we listen for one person really changing their life, really shrinking in a lot of cases, giving up things, becoming more and more isolated. Those are the kinds of things, and people adjusting their behavior, thinking and hoping that if they just do something differently, they can stop the other person's behavior. And what we know is that abuse is, because it's a choice, there's nothing that survivors really can do in this situation to change their partner's behavior. The partner has to want to change for anything to come out, for anything to be different. So especially since we are talking about faith community and what happens in faith communities, it seems like a good time to just put in that people ask us about couples counseling, and sometimes we even have clergy who get involved in couples counseling, and what we hear over and over again is when it's an abusive relationship, it just doesn't work. Because until the abuse itself until the person who's abusive deals with that and makes a conscious decision to stop being abusive, the whole model of couples counseling, of having people talk together about, well, you do this and you do that, and you give a little and you give a little. When there's abuse, when there's fear, when there's control, it's not about one person changing, bargaining. Essentially what it turns into is one person bargaining for their own safety, right? And so that's not okay, and that's not two people coming into a counselor's office on equal footing, on equal ground, with an agreement that they're both going to work on something together. And so when folks ask us about that, we often say, it's not that we're going to say that this couple is doomed forever, but until the abusive individual stops the abusive part, the controlling piece, that couple can't come together and have a balanced, equal conversation where they're each bringing something to the table and thinking about how they're going to make changes. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. It's a little confusing sometimes. All right, so this is a quick slide. The difference between faith and faith community. Some of it is I just like the stained glass. Talking to faith communities, I'll throw it in. But also, it's just important to know, when we talk about faith and faith communities, we tend to lump them together. It's all kind of one conversation, which isn't wrong, but it's important to hang on to the fact that there are people with deep faith who are not connected to a faith community, In some cases, because faith to them is just private. They don't want to be with other people. It's not something that they share. In other cases, it's because they've become isolated, or because they feel like they can't financially contribute, so they don't want to be a burden on the community, things like that. But there's lots of reasons people may not be connected with the faith community but have strong faith. And similarly, we know that there's lots of people who are tightly connected with the faith community who are not necessarily deep believers, right? They may be coming because it's a chance to sing. They may like the people. They may like the cookies, like here. They might like the social justice work. There's lots of reasons to be part of a faith community. And so in this conversation that we're about to have, I'm just going to ask you to hold those two things as equally important but different when we're talking about the role of faith and faith communities. Lauren, where's your arrow buttons? All the way to the right bottom. Oh, down there. Oh, look at me. Okay, so we talked about other kinds of abuse. Let's go to this idea about spiritual abuse. So what might spiritual abuse look like in an intimate relationship? So what might one person who's abusive do regarding the other person's faith or connection with the faith community? Again, holding them as separate things, but we're going to talk about them together. So what are some things you can think of?
Challenge their beliefs.
Challenge their beliefs. And sometimes challenge, but sometimes insult or mock, right? Why do you think God cares about you? Or why do you believe in God? Are you in third grade? Things like that. So very demeaning things, or just saying, well, what do you know about this? So absolutely. What are some other things?
Being persistently judgmental about the church the partner chooses to attend.
Right, being persistently judgmental about whatever faith community the partner wants to attend if they get there. What else? Other thoughts? What about text? What about, say, using sacred text? What could you imagine?
Misusing it or using it inappropriately.
Misusing sacred text, misquoting it, or quoting just one line. And Alex, back me up on this. It's a lot of times if you read something that seems like I have the authority to read this, if you read a couple lines down, sometimes in some of our sacred texts, do we encounter some other language that might undo that a little bit? Or say, yes, but. So this whole idea of claiming this authority, right? It says right here in our holy book that I have the right to X, Y, Z. And quoting selectively and claiming that authority of knowing what God wants exactly, right? Other thoughts?
I know sometimes too, there might be a threat to telling certain people in the faith community about different things, like the pastor or even like individual congregants about certain secrets or certain held things, and making somebody's business more public in that method also. Absolutely. I'm going to tell your secret. I know this about you, and I'm going to take it to our clergy person who thinks, they're going to have a totally different view of you. You won't be welcome anymore. I'm going to tell the community. And what's tricky about abusive individuals is sometimes that's not even something that's true. That they may say, I'm going to tell the person this, and it isn't true, but who knows? If somebody says, this is, I'm going to tell you something about my partner. And sometimes, I know a couple of these stories where the abusive individual said to their partner, I'm going to tell people that you have early onset dementia, or you have a mental illness, or you have something that's going to say, if you see my partner talking about something or acting this way, you need to come tell me so that I can know, right? Those kinds of things. I'm gonna tell people these things about you, and that's gonna further isolate you from this community. So absolutely. Other thoughts? You've hit many of the highlights. Okay. Ooh, that's a little on the story. So mocking a person's beliefs or practices, ritual objects. Where do ritual objects come from that people might have in their homes?
Family, like passed down.
Family. Absolutely, things that are passed down, right? So when somebody who's abusive takes that family heirloom object, the family Bible, the wine goblet, whatever it is, throws it out, pawns it, runs over it with the car, hides it, whatever, what does that do in addition to depriving the person of being able to use that object?
Emotionally, spiritually.
Emotionally, right. It's a huge violation, And it means that they don't have this thing that their grandmother or their great-great-grandmother, whoever it is, held, used, touched, carried out of whatever country they came from, that it breaks that chain. It's a very profound loss. Those ritual objects can be a very profound loss. And it's a way that an abusive individual can really, again, that isolation, that cutting somebody off from who they are and where they come from. So it's not just a matter of now we don't have a Bible so we can't pray, or now we don't have a wine glass so we can't do this ritual. It's now we don't have this thing that came and that's been in the family and came with us, and we've lost that chain. So it's important not to underestimate how significant some of these losses are. We talked about preventing somebody from practicing a faith, forcing somebody to practice faith. And remember, in the faith community, even within one community, if you think about what it means to be Protestant, for example, there's a lot of different expressions of Protestantism, right? So it could just be, okay, you can still be Protestant, but we're going to go to this church, which isn't really a space you're comfortable in. Again. I'm starting to think it's talking to us at certain moments. You know, it's not even just forcing somebody to completely leave a faith, but it could be even within that expression, forcing somebody into a space, and then sometimes even rewriting it. So saying, well, remember, we agreed to raise the children in this faith community, even if that conversation never happened, right? Inventing history that didn't happen. Interfering with specific practices like dietary laws, prayer, things like that. And dietary laws, I know everybody goes right to, in the Jewish community, keeping kosher, in the Muslim community, the halal, but even things like fish on Fridays, there are a lot of religions have a specific dietary something somewhere along the line in the year. So it could be interfering with that in any way. And also there are faiths where there's time-bound prayer. Can't say that fast. Right, so playing music loudly, not letting the person have a quiet space, insisting that now, even though now it's time to pray, actually it's time to go to the grocery store. Whatever that is, interfering with those kinds of things. So using sacred texts we talked about, and refusing religious divorce is an issue in some faiths. There are faiths where you don't just get married in a secular way, but you also, there's a religious component to your marriage that there's different rules depending on what faith we're talking about, but making it difficult to get divorced within that faith community. And just a reminder that emotional and verbal abuse that we talked about, that behind closed doors, lots of people don't see it, happens in very specific ways at very specific times, continues with spiritual abuse as well. Those insults, that mocking, that putting somebody down is continues with spiritual abuse also. So I'm going to tell you one quick story that comes out of some of the work that we do at my program. We were working with a survivor, and this was a number of years ago, and she observed the Sabbath in very specific ways, and so she had a Sabbath observance that was consistent with the way she understood Judaism. And so before the sun would go down on the Jewish Sabbath, she would fix the lights, because once the sun went down, she wasn't going to use electricity on Shabbat. And so the bedroom lights would be off, the living room lights would be on, her boyfriend would come over, her abusive boyfriend would come over. They would welcome the Sabbath. She had a child who at the time was maybe 6. So they would welcome the Sabbath together. And from what you've heard, even if this is the first time you've ever thought about abuse, from what you've heard tonight, what do you imagine that he did as soon as the sun went down, after she had organized everything and set it up? He flipped all the lights around, right? And so when it was bedtime, her child would cry. I think partly because the child was upset. The rules of Shabbat say that we don't touch the lights. Why is he touching the lights? What's going on here? So first of all, we have confusion. We have a child who's upset by somebody breaking the rules. And then on top of that, the child couldn't sleep, right? The lights are on. And what the boyfriend would do is look at this woman and say, well, fix the lights. What's the big deal? Turn the light off. You can take care of him. Just go do that. And what he had done was to wedge this woman very skillfully into a space where she had to decide between taking care of her child and comforting her child and following the laws of God as she understood them. Those things should always go together. That's a horrendous bind to be in. That's spiritual abuse, right? That's how deep it is. So that's what we're talking about. And just note that abuse happens across faith communities, regardless of levels of observance, defined gender roles, other differences. When we go out, I think Lauren has this experience also, when we go out into the community, and sometimes, I hate the left and the right and all of that, but more observant communities that are seen as more traditional communities will say, well, it's those people over there, right? All those people who are like bending all the sacred texts and reimagining and reinterpreting, and they're way off the intent of our faith. They don't know how to treat women. It's often a gender comment. They don't know how to treat women. It's them, right? And then we go to that community, and they say, well, those folks over there, it's a patriarchal religion, and you know they haven't, they're not up with the times, and they're stuck in this old time, and they think that this is okay, and it's them. And we have to say, no, it's not. This is something that goes across denominations.
Perhaps the biggest question that I am going to go out on a limb and speak for Julie as well, get when I introduce the type of work that I do, is the question of why doesn't she just leave? And it's always gendered, and it's always focused on why that person doesn't leave. So I want to ask you all today, what barriers might a faith community create that can make it hard to leave an abusive relationship or simply to reach out for help? Because we know leaving may not be the answer for everyone. What can you imagine that faith communities might be doing that contribute to that challenge?
Shame of divorce.
The shame of divorce, absolutely.
The basic shame of having a relationship that's not working.
The shame of a relationship not working, yeah. Shame in many forms.
Promotion of the family unit, that's something that should remain intact.
The promotion, upholding of the family as a sense of duty, as a sense of success. Absolutely. That didn't work. So what I'm hearing is a lot of tenets of faith, of what do we say is our duty to uphold. So these different areas are worrying about what would my pastor, what would my rabbi say if I come forward and talk about this, if I do want to leave the relationship, if it's temporary, if it's permanent, what is their reaction going to be? So it can be both the perceived reaction, but also for many survivors, they do talk to their religious leader, they do talk to their clergy person, and though some have incredibly supportive reactions, others don't. They may tell someone to go back. It's your job to pray it away. It's your job to be there to help change your partner. We know that clergy's reaction holds a really strong weight because of the unique role that clergy play of speaking on behalf of a higher power and knowing what impact that can have. It's a different strategy or a different weight than if myself or Julie were to talk to someone. And we also, in our profession, try not to say shoulds. We don't give directives. We're saying options. We're talking to that person to think through what's best for them. And we'll come back to that soon. Other things, I think I heard earlier over here thinking about what is the community going to react, the shame that could be impacting that as well. There could be family pressure that's existing. We've talked about shame quite a bit in a sense of failure. The difficulties of being a single person in a community of faith, many of the activities that we do, you go to with your partner. So having to try to make those choices or seeing yourself fitting in a community if you're no longer in a partnered relationship. There's also challenges presented by sacred texts, so the religious tenets of the community as well. And then thinking about things like stereotypes. This could be something like the stereotypes of the group as a whole. So thinking about communities who are already ostracized, already mislabeled. What is the misperception of someone who might be a Muslim man, of hearing that men who are Muslim are angry, who lash out, who have this image in our minds because of the way they've been construed and misconstrued through the media. Thinking that that person, well, of course that person's doing it, and blaming that person in a different type of way. Or thinking of this really meek Christian or Jewish man who would never act out in that way because that's not what that person would do. That's not the stereotype that we're seeing there. And holding those two stereotypes together and understanding the equally powerful challenges that those can create.
You presumably lose an awful lot of your own life and support if you no longer attended that church because your abuser was attending.
You absolutely could, and if you don't feel like your community, if you can't safely come into worship and you don't think your community would side with you to support you in that moment, that's a huge thing to be giving up, especially in more rural areas or areas where it might be the only church that's accessible for you or the only mosque that's accessible. Then where are you going to go for that? So it can be putting someone between impossible choices. Other thoughts or questions? Anything to?
Well, I was gonna add a little bit about stereotypes,
Yes.
if that's okay, just to, don't get out of the, come back here. I guess we're about to switch anyway. But the stereotypes thing is important, these are all important, but the stereotypes thing works against survivors in some really profound ways sometimes, just in terms of being believed. So like what we see often in communities, like in the Jewish community, the stereotypes, as Lauren said, often are the men are doctors, lawyers. I mean, they're not the big macho guys that we all expect would be the monsters that Lauren talked about. And Jewish women are often perceived as being nagging and materialistic and, you know, the whole litany. If we did an exercise, I'm sure we could make quite a list of both. And so part of what's important about the stereotypes, as Lauren was saying, is that when this person who's already perceived in one way, is already perceived as being nagging and demanding and things like that, says, this person, this pillar of the community, this stalwart of our community, this responsible, you know, doctor, lawyer, banker, or whatever the stereotype is for that faith community, it varies obviously, did this to me. What we hear from a lot of survivors is that people say to them, well, every relationship has its bumps. Say, what did you do to provoke this? Say, what did you do to make that person so mad? And that again, that blame, we talked about blame and shame, that comes back on folks through the community when that happens, because we don't look past these stereotypes. We expect people to be a certain way, and then when it's not that, a lot of times what happens in communities like the communities where we are out here. I know one story, might actually be from your program, where the person was asked, well, do you really want to pull your child out of that school system? Survivors hear these things over and over again if they get to the point where they can share what's going on with them. So these stereotypes acting in our faith communities, including sometimes from leadership, really work against people being able to say, this is what's happening to me, and I need help. Yep. And then, are there questions about this section? We're going to jump to supports in a minute, but are there questions?
I don't have a question as much as I have another thing that may be also a potential barrier. I have a background working as a chaplain in a domestic violence support program, and I know that one of the things that kept coming up too is how, especially like faith communities and family together mixed with this, but the other issue being sometimes like faith communities turning their back if somebody decides to leave their abuser, or sometimes even in atrocious cases, certain religious rites or rituals being denied a person because they chose to leave, like communion or things like that, and just how devastating it is to the person. But yeah, so I just wanted to also raise that.
Absolutely.
Definitely. And I just heard a story yesterday about somebody who encountered an abuse survivor, and it totally having nothing to do with our programs. She was not at our doorsteps at all. She was in a parking lot. Oh, you were there, you heard the story. And her faith leader had told her to go home and fix it. She had finally told him, and he told her to go home and fix it. And to her credit, she went and found some other help. And she said, I need to get some support. We don't know if he didn't believe her, or if he thought, this is what it is, you gotta go, I believe you, but you've gotta go make it better, I'm really sorry. So, absolutely. But, we are not ending here. This is, I feel like this is sort of, how are you all doing? This is like a huge, heavy lot to kind of absorb all at once. Is everybody breathing? Everybody breathe with me for a second. Okay. Because this is the part, this is what I said last week too, where I feel like if we had a soundtrack, the music would change and things would start to get a little more optimistic and hopeful. Because I've been that is amazing. I don't know. Do you have somebody back there like banging on your
Yeah, I have a
door?
little button that I press it too, right?
I know, really. I mean, it is right on cue. So we're gonna talk about supports, because I have been, I can't speak for Lauren, but I know I have been to way too many trainings where it's clergy bashing, right? Where it's all about all of the destructive things that happen in the faith community and none of the positives. And we really have to lift up the positives. We didn't have to struggle to make the list that we're gonna make about the positive and important roles that faith communities and clergy, but also lay leadership can play in helping survivors, in spreading the word, in raising awareness. I'm giving you all the answers to our last question at the end. There's a lot of things folks can do. So this is not an artificial, oh, let's put something happy at the end so that everybody can walk out smiling. These are real. So what are some of the supports that a faith community or a person's faith might be able to offer to them?
It's working trust for individual journeys and stumblings and looking for new approaches to themselves.
Yeah, trust. Look at helping people on their journeys, helping people kind of figure out where they're going. And Lauren is going to talk more about this, believing somebody, right? Remember that whole emotional abuse gray cloud thing? Survivors often have heard for years how incompetent they are, how useless they are, how stupid they are, and how affirming it is when you get to a faith community that offers you respect and believes you and listens to you. Because we have a lot of survivors who at this point believe what their abusive partner has been saying. They've been hearing it for years, right? What are some of the other supports?
I think that things have changed so much in 20 years that when I first started out with the Roundtable, the clergy really didn't give any idea to the congregation that they were even going to discuss domestic violence ever. And it's so different now. I see all the congregations are more open, I think, and welcoming. They specifically always say, if they have anything written, that they're welcoming no matter where you are, and what walk of life, gender, it doesn't matter, you're welcome. And I see that as a huge change. And I think all the congregations I know of in our areas are much more open. And I think people are much more likely to come and talk about their situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it may not be a perfect world yet, but it's really getting there. We're getting so much better.
It's true.
Yeah.
Thank you. Other thoughts about supports?
Well, I think a lot of the work that the Roundtable has done over the years too is to try to get, they may not have all the answers to give to the clergy, but they can give the clergy referrals so that if, say, one of their congregants come to them and they're able to say, you know, I'm sorry that this has happened or whatever, they can at least be concerned for their safety too and be able to refer them to someone like an agency like yours.
Absolutely.
You know,
Ours.
in addition to the clergy's support of that person, but also, you know, be another step to like, you know, keep that person safe or give them other support.
Absolutely. And, you know, you all are paying great attention and you're very attentive, but we are not expecting after an hour and a half you're walking out of here being domestic abuse advocates, right? Not your job, not your lives, you're all gonna go back to your lives. But now you could be ambassadors, bridges, and that's one of the things that the clergy has been and continues to be are, you know, I'm not really sure, it's totally fine to say, not really sure how to help you other than the stuff that Lauren's gonna talk about, some basic things to say. But I know who can. I know the programs that are thinking this, breathing this, living this 24/7. So let me help you connect. Other thoughts before I give you the rest of the answers?
I think also it's important to maintain that support. You know, just it's absolutely to the future, as it were. So always keep checking back in, always be there.
Absolutely. Clergy and congregational leaders or whoever it is in the community who happens to know what's going on have that opportunity to be with people over a long journey. And it doesn't mean, I know sometimes when we talk to people about this, there's a lot of concern. I mean, clergy are very busy people, right? So they don't have time to be somebody's 24/7 support. And so, you know, helping create that space where clergy can be supportive, but also know how to continue to encourage somebody into directions where they can get help. So that the clergy person isn't the 3-hour meeting twice a week with this person, but can still be supportive and gentle and loving and model all of that and model respect and model just saying to the person, you do belong here. Like this is a space where you belong and we're happy to have you here. So social supports, breaking isolation, belief in a higher power, right? Faith. This is why we separated faith and faith community. That faith can be tremendous. Faith-based answers from leaders occasionally. We had a woman who called us. She had fled an abusive relationship. One was Catholic, and she had gone to nuns, and the nuns helped her. The nuns didn't send her back and say marriage is forever. They believed her, they listened, they helped her. She said, I don't want a divorce. It's against my religion. And the nun said to her, you don't have to live like this. You don't have to be treated this way. We can't do much about the marriage, but you don't have to be there. And I've heard that people who've gone to priests, who've gone to rabbis, who've gone to clergy people who have said, even in cases where the religion itself doesn't really allow for divorce, people who have focused on safety and on this, how can you be safe, right? You don't have to live it. God doesn't want you, or the higher power, whatever that faith refers to the higher power as, that higher power does not want you to be in danger, does not want the children to be in danger. We don't want you to be in danger, right? Help from leadership, family. Okay, these last two, this is new. We're just starting to talk about this. I think when Lauren and I sat down and made the list, we're like, oh yeah. Oftentimes faith communities have stuff, right? They have phones, computers, things that people, remember, if somebody's going through your phone, you can't call a helpline on your phone, because how do you explain that you're on the phone for 45 minutes with Reach? But your faith community might have a phone and a door you can close, private office, private space, might have somebody who could watch your kids for a couple hours, might be able to connect you with somebody who can hang out with your kids so you can meet with an advocate. And then sometimes clergy have some limited financial assistance. And sometimes clergy have some kind of discretionary fund where they could not pay your bills for the next 6 months, but maybe pay for a hotel for a couple of nights so you can figure out what to do next. Maybe help you with the security deposit, maybe help with something. So faith communities, we overlook them as sources of material support, but in some cases they're in a position to do that.
And we know that supporting survivors is more than just that stuff, it's more than just the huge things that are there. We want you to be able to walk away from here knowing what is it that you can do, what can you actually say that will make a difference for someone. So the most important thing, if you take nothing else away from our training, please take away this. If a survivor chooses to disclose to you, shares their story with you, please validate that person and support them. Saying things as simple as, I believe you. The abuse is not your fault. You are not alone. And there are resources. Help is available. If you can be a part of that help or you can facilitate a connection, those statements are short and they're small, but they can make the biggest difference. Because if the opposite is being said, if it's being implied that the survivor is responsible for the abuse or that they're not being believed, will they continue reaching out to others for help? It's really unlikely because that shuts down the conversation. You can be that bridge for someone, and even if it feels scary and overwhelming, simply saying, wow, I'm so sorry you're going through that. I believe you. I'm here for you. Who else are you talking to? And connecting with those resources can be life-changing. So we want to quickly talk through what are the types of resources that are available. Julie and I both work at different domestic violence programs. There are a few others in this area as well, including the Second Step, Voices Against Violence, and Domestic Violence Services Network. We all do slightly different but very similar stuff, so this is our overlapping areas for the most part. We do things like provide direct support for survivors. We do that in different ways, but a survivor does not need to leave the relationship to work with any of our programs. We're here for them no matter where they are on life's journey. We also do things like offer consultation for family and friends. This is one of the biggest parts of my job. I'm here to be a supporter for you. So if you're on the front line, if you have someone in your office and you're like, I just don't know what to do with this person, how do I support them? I can be here as a resource, and our hotlines are also there as a resource 24/7 to talk through these options. We've spoken with doctors, lawyers, clergy, police officers, people who have called us who are at a loss of what to do next, who need some support themselves. And we can offer both that emotional support for them, but also the resources and how to navigate them and help them through that process. We can do conversations with clergy, with community professionals, and be there to be able to drink a cup of coffee, connect with resources, whatever it is that communities are needing. Then we do a number of awareness raising and educational type programs. We all do that in slightly different ways at slightly different capacities. My entire job is prevention focused, so I'm doing a lot of those conversations out in the community. For some of us, we're wearing like 6 different hats because that's the nonprofit life, so we're stretched pretty thin, but we're all here to provide those supports as well. And in this community, the Domestic Violence Roundtable, which brought this program together, is an incredible resource of facilitating those awareness-raising conversations. And we know that taking action is really important. I think you're leading in, Phyllis?
I think we're co-leading, so this is very graceful, our choreography here. I'm gonna come over here so we don't block the thing. But we're really just together asking you, so what can communities do? And this is a brainstorm, there's no right answer, there's no right answer. And I should also say, although it just us who take a big breath, that what communities can do looks different community to community. So there's no out of the box. We would never come to a community and say, okay, here's your map. Here's what you do. When we meet with communities, we want to know, like, what makes sense? What are you interested in? What are you thinking about? So we're going to put some of those ideas up on the board, but there is no one, like, model that we can take out, hand a community and say, do this, and everyone will be safe, right? So, were you about to say something?
I was going to say that using First Parish Wayland as an example, it's that sense of a safe space where you are going to be able to speak. Because, for instance, as you walk in, there's a flyer for this event on the wall, hotline cards in the bathroom, a collection box outside the domestic violence shelter, various other, just this general feel that you will be okay here if you choose to share with somebody. It doesn't have to be the minister necessarily, any member of that community, but it's a community that will support you. So I think you can send that message without actually saying anything in just what's around the space, really.
Yeah.
And normalizing that conversation.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like something out of the box. It
That's right.
feels just walking around the building like something that's been an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, no, I know one congregation that has male clergy and female clergy, and the male clergy person said, well, we don't have to talk about this because it doesn't happen here. Female clergy person started, and this is not about gender, these people could be any gender, but the female clergy person started to talk about it, and people started to come to her and tell her the stories, right? So it's not, they didn't go because she identified as female, they went because she started talking about it, and people came, and of course, people had stories in the congregation, but they hadn't been invited to share them.
My minister had wanted to preach on abuse a year or so ago, and I was really excited and warned him that as soon as he started speaking about it, he was going to start hearing disclosures. So asked him how he was prepared to do that, and ended up working with him pretty extensively ahead of time to make sure he was ready, and lo and behold, that definitely happened, and he knew where to direct people, but wouldn't have otherwise. So for clergy who are thinking of it, we always encourage some prep work ahead of time. It's an incredible thing to do, and we want to make sure you're prepared for the onslaught of disclosures that may follow. Sorry, I know there was.
Well, that's what I was gonna say, that I think it's important, when you're gathering for services, that the person in charge, that's leadership, is able to speak to it. From the pulpit, from wherever in their faith. I think that means a lot when people hear the words actually coming out. And it's great to do the community and social justice with drives for goods and, having all the materials that people have. But I think when you hear that leadership speak to it, it acknowledges that it is here.
Absolutely. Other thoughts?
The provision of safe spaces, which we said in a number of other ways, to try to make sure that there are opportunities scheduled and open to the public and protected for people who want to talk about either their perceptions of the problem or their own personal challenges or how to help a friend who's facing it.
Absolutely. So we've covered a lot of this, posters with helpline numbers, and I will say the faith communities, for somebody who has their partner going through their phone, and they're not entirely confident that they can erase their browser history, they may not be able to look up Reach or Journey to Safety or any of our programs, but it may be okay for them to go onto their faith community's website saying, oh, I wonder what time this program is or something like that. And if they find a helpline number there, that might be a space. They can't get all the information, they won't, but they can at least see where that phone number is. Including helplines, encouraging clergy to preach, but as Lauren said, with some support. And this is another, encouraging clergy to include public words of prayer support for survivors of abuse and their children. So for those of you who are connected with the faith community, and you think about the lead into parts of services where people are recalling lost, they're dead, right? They're dead relatives, they're family members. Different denominations have different moments where this remembrance happens, whether it's at specific times of the year or specific parts of the service. And what kind of language do we usually hear when people are talking about that? Like the lead in to those prayers. How are those folks remembered or described? Lovingly, right? Are we in the Jewish, in some of the prayer books, there's something about in the blowing of the wind, we remember them, and in I forget the whole thing, I'm gonna mess it up if I do it. There's an assumption that every loss, every memory of a loss is somebody that is, that person who's remembering them is remembering them in this very loving way. And that's incredibly alienating and isolating for survivors who are in that space for any number of reasons, but who may not have those feelings and who may have felt very alienated from that person, who may be feeling very ambivalent about that loss or even relieved. Because I've heard a number of survivors say, I didn't feel safe until my partner died. And not with any joy, not with any happiness about it, but just knowing that person was still driving up and down their street or was still out there, was still threatening them until that person was not among us anymore. So to ask faith communities to just be aware of the fact that there are survivors in the community, and that when we get to those memorial prayers, to create some space for survivors. It doesn't mean don't say all those other beautiful, loving things, but to just acknowledge that not everybody may have those feelings and memories about that person, and give them a space to acknowledge the loss, but not in the same way that other people may be thinking about their loss. Does that make sense? It's a lot of words. Do you want to pick it up from here?
Yeah, so the last two are more big picture type things. So thinking about creating policies, especially things like employee policies for those who are working that allow for leave or job protection to deal with things like work or medical or other related expenses, depending on the size of the institution. There are also state laws that could come into play here as well. And then doing things that could feel smaller, like a lead-in, that are huge for survivors, like doing donation drives, collections, sponsoring a family for holiday gift, like Sue mentioned earlier in our conversation today, doing something like a toiletry drive or sponsoring any of those other things. The financial resources can play a huge role for folks.
And it's an opportunity for awareness raising, right? Because why is this box out here, and who are these people who need this stuff, and why do they need this stuff? And don't they live in Boston? Or don't they live in Worcester? And why, what are we doing and who is it going to? It gives you an opportunity to really talk about a lot of the stuff is going to stay here in this community or in nearby communities. And these are our neighbors, in some cases our congregants. So that awareness raising, and I totally skipped another big awareness raising, is bring these programs to your faith communities. We would love to come out, obviously we come out at night, so we would love to come and talk and do programs that are tailored for your community, and make it as specific as we can when we can match it to a faith that one of us is familiar with, or we know somebody else who trains specifically about that faith. Bring that to a community, but have these conversations. And again, to really encourage, this is something Lauren talked about, to encourage clergy to consult with us. We don't, and leaders, congregational leaders, or whoever in the community happens to receive a disclosure, happens to be present when somebody says this is happening to me. Use us, use all 5 of our programs. We are here. You're not taking time away from survivors when you call and ask us for help, for guidance, for support for yourselves. So, and also just recalling Lauren's puppy. When you walk out of here, if you're walking out of here holding any feelings, holding anything this leaving you unsettled, that this has pushed a button, that this has triggered something in you, we're gonna really encourage you to call one of our programs, call a trusted friend, call somebody you know, but do something to take care of yourself and not to carry that story by yourself. Not to be alone with that, but just ask somebody to share your story with you so that you're not by yourself. And if you feel like you have even more need than that, certainly reach out to one of our programs and we would be happy to support you.
Thank you all for spending the night with us. If anyone has questions that you'd rather ask one-on-one, please feel free to come grab one of us. We do have a few handouts, so it's just an awkward room, so we didn't do them when we normally do, but I'm going to leave them on the table in the back. They have continued resources and how faith communities can respond, so please help yourself to them.
Yes, and huge thanks to First Parish.
Yes.
So is there anything you want to close us out?
Yes. Well, I'd like to thank Julie and Laura so much for this lovely, wonderful presentation. Every time I hear them speak, I learn something new. Every time I hear them speak, I have another reflection about some aspect of what they're saying. So I think we're extraordinarily lucky at the round table to have people like Julie and Laura with us all the time. And I want to thank First Parish very much, as I said at the very beginning, for all your ongoing continuing partnerships. And if you have any thoughts or ideas, I'm sorry if I seem to distract at the end there by handing these around, but I knew it was important to get some feedback from you all.
Yes.
So if you have any thoughts and ideas you'd like to write suggestions, please do. And if you would like to be in contact with the Roundtable in any way, you can go to our website, which is www.domesticviolenceroundtable.org, and you'll see phone numbers, emails, all the information you'll need should you want to get back to Laura and Julie through the Roundtable. So if you just join with me in thanking them, and thank you all for coming.